All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to see us or coming online to see us for Veterans Day. My name is Rich Bradway, and I'm the Director of Digital Learning and Engagement for the Norman Rockwell Museum.
I think I'm back.
There we go. Today, we're here to take a look at a seldom seen and heard of program called the Combat Artist Program. It's been called many different things over the years, but essentially it is a program organized by our government and our military that enlists artists and soldier artists to make pictorial records of what our armed service men and women do. For me, I'm a child of a veteran. My father served in the occupation of Europe after World War II. He served in the Army and spent a significant amount of his time serving in Graves registration. Although he did not see active combat, he sure saw the results of it. It was this selfless work that crystallized my admiration for my father's time in the service of our country. And by association, this admiration extends to all of our armed men and women and the work that they do. We're here today because the Norman Rockwell Museum has dedicated this program to our veterans. Norman Rockwell himself, a veteran of the Navy, frequently depicted our armed services in various manifestations during his career. Most notably, his fictional character, a GI by the name of Willie Gillis, had a recurring appearance on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post throughout and after World War II. Although the museum has focused on the work of Norman Rockwell, the museum's mission also focuses on the larger field of illustration and the power images have in shaping and reflecting our culture and society. And so today we look at the role of the combat artist. For me, this all started 5 years ago when I first met Victor Juhasz. That particular year, the museum had two exhibits that highlighted our nation's military men and women and the impact of combat on them. The first exhibition was Masters of the Golden Age, Harvey Dunn and his students. This exhibition showcased the incredible work of Harvey Dunn, who for part of his career as an illustrator was a member of the American Expeditionary Forces, recording the unforgettable realities of combat during World War I. The second exhibit at the time was called Love a Vet, honoring our veterans. This exhibit featured paintings, drawings, and prints by a diverse group of contemporary illustrators, many of which were actively involved in the military. Victor Juhasz's artwork was not only in this latter exhibit, but he was also the featured speaker for our Veterans Day program that year. It was during this presentation in the program it was during his presentation that I learned about the work of the combat artist. Through subsequent conversations with Victor, I discovered that despite the ubiquity of cameras and photography today, a number of artists and illustrators are still actively engaged to serve as combat artists, depicting the dedicated work of our armed men and women. Before I introduce today's panelists, I would like to introduce Stephanie Plunkett. Stephanie Plunkett is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Norman Rockwell Museum and the organizer of many illustration exhibitions. Before we get started, Stephanie will briefly share perspectives on the history of the embedded art and artists. Stephanie?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you to the amazing artists we have with us today. Happy Veterans Day. We are absolutely thrilled to have our artists and all of you in the audience with us. So we wanted to start out, as Rich said, Norman Rockwell Museum is dedicated to the art of illustration. And of course, the history of combat art is very, very extensive. So we thought it might be interesting to just take 5 minutes to give you a very, very brief history of combat art, just as a lead-in to the work of these amazing contemporary artists. So I'll just start out by saying, I'll just make a distinction between reportage illustration, which is what our artists are doing. And of course, that's the creation of a visual record of events made as an eyewitness account, whether commissioned by a publication or a government entity. And that is distinguished from the concept of propaganda, which is designed to influence the public in support of certain ideas and beliefs. And of course, sometimes they are melded, as we know. The history of artists working in the field is long, spanning the Revolutionary War to today's global engagements. So let's take a look at just a few highlights and give you a sense of some of the artists and work that has been done in the past. Despite the growing efficiency of cameras in the 19th century, photography on the battlefield was difficult due to long exposures and cumbersome equipment. Because of this, Civil War illustrator reporters like Winslow Homer, Alfred Woud, and Edwin Forbes were engaged by Harper's, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and other publications to capture events and action that photography at the time could not. Even in the 20th century, as photographic technology advanced, wartime illustrators remained in demand as skilled practitioners that were able to prioritize aspects of chaotic situations and assemble compelling visual evidence to communicate complex events simultaneously and with empathy and emotion. Official war artists have been part of the American military since 1917, and programs sponsored by branches of the armed forces continue today. After the United States entry into World War I, the War Department called upon the Division of Pictorial Publicity to stimulate support for the Allied cause. Illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, who you see here and who was the creator of the Gibson Girl, was at the time the president of the Society of Illustrators, and he acted as art director to oversee more than 700 poster designs and many more thousands of pieces of propaganda. He also handpicked 8 volunteer illustrators to accompany and document the American Expeditionary Forces, nicknamed the 8, including William Aylward, Wallace Morgan, and Harvey Dunn, among others. Commissioned to document the U.S. Army's role in the war, they were first stationed in the rear, far from fighting, but Dunn urged Army command to let his contingent go to the front lines. Commissioned as captain in the Engineer Reserve Corps, Dunn was 33 years old and had no previous military training. Stationed in France, he brought along a sketch box of his own design, fitted with drawing paper on a cylindrical scroll that allowed him to move more easily from one drawing to the next. Attached to Company A of the 167th Infantry, he faced fire himself and recorded the men's struggles and casualties firsthand. These pressures left little time to finish works or send art back to the United States for publication as intended. Artists expected to have time to paint and draw from their rough sketches once retired from duty, but after the armistice, the military's interest in the project waned, and it was years later before he would actually complete his paintings. Discharged in April 1919, Dunn returned home on the USS North Carolina and would ultimately complete 33 paintings based upon his wartime experiences. Rather than focusing only on the drama of soldiers in action that had been envisioned by the military, Dunn faithfully recorded a full spectrum of emotions and experiences in his art. In 1928, Dunn completed several of his war compositions for the American Legion, which published his dramatic portrayals inspired by his first-hand experiences on the cover of the magazine. During World War II, the U.S. Army, the U.S. military supported artists on all fronts in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Commissioned and trained as soldiers, they were encouraged to capture everything from the most devastating to the mundane, and more than 2,000 works were created. In 1943, Life magazine covered the war when the military art program lost its congressional funding and deactivated the art unit. Life engaged sidelined artists to travel with the armed forces to capture combat experiences for the magazine. Now on view here at the Norman Rockwell Museum in our Four Freedoms exhibition, Thomas Lee's The 2,000-Yard Stare from the collection of the United States Army is one powerful example. Compassion for soldiers is nearly universal in war art, and here Lee portrays a traumatized, battle-fatigued soldier who has been deeply affected by the war raging behind him. Abbott Laboratories, which provided pharmaceuticals and medical supplies to the armed forces during World War II, sponsored artist correspondent Kerr Eby to travel with the U.S. Marines in the Pacific. A pacifist, Eby created some of the most stirring work of the period. For example, Ebb Tide, a stark charcoal drawing, communicates a sense of devastation even before we realize that there are figures lying motionless in the water. Newspaper illustrator Howard Brody documented the war for the San Francisco Chronicle and worked for Yank magazine in both Europe and the Pacific. After the war, Brody became a courtroom artist and returned to the battlefields of Korea, Indochina, and Vietnam. The Army newspaper Stars and Stripes featured the work of Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Bill Malden, whose characters Willie and Joe portrayed soldiers with a sense of dark humor that proved to be popular with his appreciative audience. So this is just a little bit of background on a rather extraordinary history, and we are so excited to have our contemporary practitioners tell us a lot more about it. And back to Rich.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was great. So what I'd like to do now is just do a quick introduction of each of the panelists, and then we'll get into today's program, if you don't mind. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. First, we have Michael Fay. While in the Marines, Michael D. Fay served in the Presidential Helicopter Squadron under President Reagan and participated in Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Eastern Exit, and Provide Promise campaigns. He re-enlisted into the Marine Corps Reserve in January 2000 to fill the billet of combat artist with the Field History Detachment supporting the Historical Division of the Marine Corps. Michael's goal is to communicate the human face of war. During his numerous deployments between 2003 and 2013 to war zones, Army hospitals, and the Guantanamo prison complex, Steve Mumford made hundreds of drawings on the spot, bearing witness to war and its consequences. Mumford synthesizes experiences and observations from his trips into large-scale oil paintings that involve specific and universal aspects of war. He's also interested in covering current events in his art, such as the BP oil spill that he documented for Harper's Magazine. Recently, Steve Mumford's artwork depicting many current events of the last 6 months was on view at the Postmaster Gallery in New York City. That exhibit just closed on October 31st. Elise McKelvey is a graduate of the illustration program at Lesley University and was deployed various times to include one mission to the Middle East to document Marines in action in 2019. Staff Sergeant McKelvey is a combat artist with the U.S. Marine Corps Combat Art Program, which is managed by the National Museum of the Marine Corps. During one mission, when several Marines were killed in an Osprey aircraft crash in Hawaii, Staff Sergeant McKelvey was able to share with the victims' families her sketches of the men during their last days. Elise Mckelvey's combat artwork can be seen currently at the Peace River Botanical and Sculpture Gardens in Punta Gorda, Florida, until November 21st. And if I'm not mistaken, you recently have left the service a few weeks ago, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. Originally serving as a Marine Reservist from 1986 until 1996, Kristopher Battles became a Marine combat artist after re-enlisting in 2006 and deployed to Overseas Contingency Operations several times to create art for the United States Marine Corps, serving in that billet until 2014. Now a civilian, Battles is the Marine Corps Artist in Residence at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. And Victor Juhasz is a popular political and editorial illustrator for many of today's major magazines and newspapers. Victor began collaborating with the Joe Bonham Project in 2011, drawing and painting wounded soldiers and Marines at Bethesda Naval Hospital and McGuire Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Documentation related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That year, he embedded with 152nd Arctic Thunder Dustoff medevac unit in Kandahar, accompanying Army medics on helicopter rescue missions. The resulting drawings and writings inspired by his experiences in Afghanistan were published in the online edition of GQ magazine in 2012. His visual documentation is part of the permanent collections of both the U.S. Air Force and the United States Marine Corps. Recently, in June 2020, Victor's artwork sketching essential workers during the COVID-19 pandemic was highlighted by Rolling Stone magazine. So thank you all for attending today and participating in this program. I'm really looking forward to what we are going to be talking about. So what I thought I would do is start off with the question, why be a combat artist? How do you explain to soldiers you are depicting what you do? And I guess I'll start with Michael. This is Michael's image here.
That's a big question. A lot of Marines were not aware that there was an art program. And so when I showed up in Kandahar in the first week of January 2002, part of what I had to do was explain to them why I was there. And so I had to come up with an explanation. And most Marines understand that the Marine Corps, to a large degree, exists because of our history and traditions. And part of my job, and at that time with the Marine Corps History Division, was to capture their experience, and of course my experience, through artwork. And once I sat down and started sketching, the whole experience took on a life of its own. The Marines appreciated the fact that the Marine Corps not only had photographers, but had sent artists, at least one artist, out to the far tip of the spear. And just like you had said, to get the full spectrum of the emotions and the experience, which included my emotions and experience as well. And the first painting you saw is called All Eyes Down. And
this one here?
Right. And what I realized, this was the first time it was like Shel Silverstein, where the sidewalk ends. And the Marines were walking very, very carefully, as well as myself, because the area around Kandahar International Airport was heavily mined. And the type of mines that they had weren't the big ones. They were little toe poppers. They were meant to create casualties. And they had been there since the Soviets had been there. And they still worked. Every day somebody was losing a foot. So when you're walking, not only you were kind of scanning and looking at the horizon and what was around you, but I realized based on my own experience, there was a whole aspect of all eyes down. And because those that are in the Marine Corps will understand this, Marines we're never supposed to put our hands in our pockets. Well, guys had their hands in their pockets. It was cold. And so I included that, and because the art collection wanted me to show not what the Marine Corps would want to see, but what actually the experience was like, because it was cold and their hands were in their pockets. The next image is actually the three gentlemen that are off to the the left. Here they are, and this is a piece called Setting Trip Flares. The area we were in, the Mujahideen would come in every night and set up in a lot of these blasted buildings. And these buildings weren't where poor people lived. This is where the very well-to-do, like pilots and administrators for the airport had lived. And in the foreground, you can see those sort of geometric looking things. Those are ammo boxes for AK-47 rounds. And so what they did is they were setting up trip flares across the openings so that when people came back at night, flares would go off to let us know that they had returned to shoot at us. And it was right at sunset, so it was extremely beautiful, the light. So as an illustrator and as an artist, I was kind of conscious of the purple and yellow, and I tilted things a little bit just to make it more visually interesting. So that's sort of the artist at work.
Thank you. Steve, why did you become a combat artist?
Well, I didn't exactly set out to become a combat artist. I thought of myself simply as an artist that had an interest in the war when it got started. I remember in 2003 when we were preparing to invade Iraq, and I was working on a series of paintings in my studio about the Vietnam War. And I had always loved the work of Winslow Homer. In fact, I kind of grew up with that work in Boston, where they have a nice collection. And of course, Homer did all this wonderful Civil War work, not just sketches in the field, but paintings afterwards. So kind of late in the game, it occurred to me, gee, maybe I could try to do the same thing. And at that point, the embedding process was finished. There was no way to join that. So I decided just to fly to Kuwait and kind of hang out in the mornings next to a fancy hotel where the journalists were going into Iraq. And this was right after the initial part of the invasion. I think fighting was still going on in Baghdad at that point. And I wound up getting a ride with a couple of French journalists. And so we kind of went through Basra and Nasiriyah, various towns on the way to Baghdad. We took about, I don't know, maybe 10 days to get there. And by the time we got to Baghdad, the fighting had stopped, but everything was in a kind of a state of quiet chaos, with the US Army attempting to act as a sort of pseudo police force and not doing it very well. But for me, it was like a playground. I just wandered all around Baghdad with my sketch pad. Eventually found a unit of American soldiers who agreed to let me join them on patrols. Everything was completely informal at that point. And then I was hooked. And I guess just as an artist who was interested in drawing from life and kind of telling the naturally dramatic stories about life in a war zone, it was an amazing experience.
So, Steve, I got a question from our viewers, Kristen, and looking at this particular image, while you're embedded, do you make your art, is it drawn from photographs? Is it from memory? Is this what you're seeing? I'm just curious, because this is
right. So this one is kind of the exception. Generally, my rule is to always work from life. And I would always take photographs while I was working from life. I had a small point and shoot camera, so I could sort of quickly and unobtrusively take a split second to grab a photograph while I'm drawing. And the point of that is if I can't finish the drawing from life, then I have a reference to use if I want to add more detail. In a case like this, this was an IED that went off in Ramadi, and it happened in a split second. And I had literally just time enough to grab my camera and take the picture as the smoke and dust was settling from the IED. And so this was entirely done after the fact. Generally, I found that was the case with combat. Combat, in my experience, was always, or almost always, over quickly. And it was hard to actually draw while combat was going on, although there were a couple of interesting exceptions. So most of the drawings that I did, and I made 8 trips to Iraq and Afghanistan, the great majority of the drawings are things that happened in between any kind of combat. But yeah, usually with action like this, it was often done either from photographs directly or using photographs as well as the drawing.
So we'll take a look at another one, and this one here is just, a pretty stark image here. Can you talk about this, and was this from photography or from memory, or how did you?
So there's sort of a difference in my work between drawings that are done in the field and large paintings that are done in the studio afterwards. This is a large painting. I believe it's around 8 feet tall, maybe 7.5 feet tall. So the drawing that I did a couple of drawings based on this. This was kind of the worst case scenario in the Baghdad ER. I was embedded there for almost a month. And it was in 2007 when there were a great deal of casualties coming in during the surge. So it unfortunately was not uncommon to have somebody brought in this case, a soldier who'd been hit by an IED. His body seemed to be intact, but his organs had, I guess, been turned to jelly from the concussion of the IED. They were desperately trying to save him. This was usually a last-ditch method. First CPR, then they would crack open his chest and try to massage his heart directly. And it rarely worked. And in this case, it didn't. I was struck afterwards, after working on the drawing, by how much it reminded me of Renaissance or Baroque paintings of like a deposition from the cross. The sort of almost the pyramid-like composition of her being on top of him, trying to bring life back into his body. So what happened was, back in the studio, I hired models to recreate the situation and bought the kind of appropriate clothing that they're wearing in the Baghdad ER. So this painting is much more artificial. Usually I would find that every so often I do a drawing that to me seemed to go beyond the specifics of that scene. It suggested certain universalities of all wars, in this case, losing a casualty. And so I would try to do a painting where it didn't have to have all of the detail of the actual scene, or it didn't have to have those particular people. It just had to give a sort of feeling of verisimilitude of what it was like to be there, but also these larger issues of what it means to be in or near a war zone.
So just because I probably didn't make it quite clear, 3 of you were in active service prior to becoming artist soldiers or soldier artists, and 2 of you are civilians. Is that correct?
Correct.
And can you speak a little bit to those of you who were soldiers, what was was there any particular training that you were given so that you could be prepared for this? And the same thing, I guess, would go for the 2 civilians. Were you placed through any type of training to prepare for what you would be doing as combat artists? And I open it up to the floor.
Well, on the Marine side, we are, and Mike Fay and Chris Battles are the ones that taught me this, which is we're Marines first and artists second. So that means that we go through training just like other Marines. We go to boot camp, MCT, and then we go to our primary job duties. Since combat art isn't a primary job, it's more like a billet or a secondary job within our job. So we get all the training, we learn how to shoot a rifle, so that when we are, and if we are in the front lines, we can not be a liability and we're able to take care of ourselves and the Marines around us.
As the war went on, a whole a process of getting training and getting certified as being trained evolved. When I first went, there was just some informal training. I mean, they took it for granted that we were physically fit, that we knew how to, live in the field, take care of our weapons. Initially, when I first went, E6 as staff sergeants and above were only given pistols. Later on in the war, everybody had to carry not only a pistol, but you had to have a rifle, a long gun. We also went through then training with regards to IEDs, ambush training, depending on where you were sitting in a Humvee, if you got ambushed, what your job was, things like that. But later on, there did become a certification process and different training that you had to do. But initially, I was just issued some gear, and the gear that I was issued the first time was not the newer stuff. I had the old Alice sort of post-Vietnam gear, and then later on we got the more involved Molly system. But a lot was taken for granted. and as Elise said, and Chris will say, as Marines, it was very important that we didn't show up as a liability. That because if you did, then you wouldn't get out. And certainly Victor, he can share with you. I mean, once even as a civilian, and same with Steve, when they realize that what you're doing is valuable, and then also that you would pitch in, they would come find you, say, hey, we're going on a patrol, or we have a react, something happened, an ambush, and we got to go, and, why don't you come with us? Yeah, so, certainly as civilian guys, there might have been some training, something they had to go through.
Victor, do you have to go through training?
No, I didn't go through training as much as I was present, luckily, during training exercises, and kind of like learned on the spot things to do and not to do. When Mike was first encouraging me back in 2010 or so to go overseas and embed and draw, I was like, well, isn't it a good idea for that I should know what to do in case the shit hits the fan? I mean, it would be a good idea to know. And I'd say that luckily, especially with the Marine Corps, you're in the situations with them, and even though it's not when we're documenting the training exercises, it's obviously not actual combat, but you're also learning in a very surface way certain rules about not getting in people's way. Certainly for what Mike was referring to before, as a Marine, you did not want to be a liability. And certainly as a civilian, you definitely don't want to be a liability, because they have enough to do in a serious situation.
So Elise and Chris, I'm going to go to you next. How do you explain, and we're looking at Elise's work now, how do you explain to yourself to your fellow soldiers what you're doing and why you're there?
For me, it's interesting since I was in uniform. Oftentimes the Marines just kind of accepted me there, but I was also attached to these units as a photographer or a public affairs sort of job title. So when I initially get there, that's what they think I'm doing. And then I start to break out the sketchbook, and I slowly talk to them about combat art and the history of it. And often when you mention to Marines that your portrait or you're going to be in the museum, you're going to be in the history books, they get excited. And telling them that the difference between what I did in my primary job, which was advocating for the Marine Corps in a certain light, and the Combat Artist Program, which tells the story in the raw emotion as it is, they like that. And it takes some time, but I've never had any issues. And once you start drawing Marines, they all love it.
So what are we looking at here?
Yeah, this is what Victor was mentioning, which was a training exercise in Quantico, Virginia, through the basic school, which is where the officers get trained. And they were doing a mount town. So basically they were raiding these buildings and learning how to navigate tactically through, smoke screens to get to their objective. And that was a depiction of this moment. It is very fast paced. It's very hard to sketch these events from life. You'll get very, very rough drawings. So often we'll take those photos and those sketches and make final paintings, which is what you see here.
Elise, can you just explain what MOUT is, the acronym?
Yeah, MOUT is, you guys, military occupation. Wait, what is it? Urban train. So basically it's an urban environment with buildings, and it was really important during Afghanistan and Iraq, where they were doing that door-to-door situations like they were back in the day, to learn how to navigate in those environments. So Mount Town is very important for their training, and that's what that is. And this is another sketch from the same situation where a Marine was sights down range, making sure that his fellow Marines were getting where they needed to go. This is just a micron pen sketch. Very quick.
And Chris,
Yeah.
tell us your story. You know, why the, you know, you actually actively became a part of this program, and your images range quite dramatically. And here's an example of one. What's the name of this one called again?
This is of binocs, bottles, and flypaper, and it's a slice of life image. Most, of course, situations in the military, whether you're even in a combat zone or not, are simply slice of life. That just every day, every Marine, what they're going through, boredom, you name it, everything that's going on. So here I was fascinated as an artist with the light coming through the flypaper and the bottles, because all artists like to paint light, whether it's allegorical, symbolic, or real. And it's a joy in pushing paint around as well. But we also love to tell the story. So this was just one of those situations where the composition and the narrative and the interesting composition and formal art structure came together. So I did sketch these gentlemen while they were there. A lot of times when you're in a fob, you can go around and do this sort of thing. There's plenty of downtime. But I also snapped a bunch of pictures. And so this was one of those where there was some really good artistic things coming through, as well as the narrative.
I also want to say that with Chris's inside the watchtower, you know, a big part of our art is that it would resonate with Marines even years from now.
Amen.
And every Marine that was in Iraq or Afghanistan this was a lot of their time was spent this way. And
Yeah.
for your viewers, if you go on YouTube, just Google or do the search engine "Mama Dog." So all you got to put in is "Mama Dog," and you'll see you'll understand once if they watch.
Yes. The boredom will make you almost lose your mind. This is actually a sketch from training, but it is from life. You know, you learn how to sketch very quickly. The good part about training is you don't have to worry about getting shot. There were at least one time where I had to sort of say, oh, I better not really draw right now because I can see the village. And if the village can see me, then that's not a good thing necessarily, that I'm sitting here open to be shot. Anyway, but so we do a lot of sketching as rapidly as you can. Your pencil is just going or whatever you're using to draw with. And then like everyone has said, we take those and they inform our formal pictures, our more fine art studio pictures in the rear. And also we do, if you can see right here, you got the name and the date, and we try to get their get who we're drawing, because we are telling their story. It is about specific people, but it's also about the archetypes. But we do like to make sure that you know, years from now, that person can say, hey, you know, that was me right there. You know?
Mike, didn't you once tell me that you were on with your unit and you sat down and you started drawing, and the next thing you knew, you looked up and nobody was around you anymore?
Well, yeah, that was when I was first in Afghanistan, and that's when I realized that the camera came in handy. I also had a situation in Ramadi at the government center where I sat down on a rooftop, and Chris sort of said it, but I was there sketching, and a sergeant who was sort of the sergeant of the guard on the rooftop of the government center came over to me, and I was a gunnery sergeant by that point. He sort of chastised me and said, you know, you probably need to move because you don't have your helmet or flak on. He goes, we have active snipers. And I realized, I'm in a rather exposed position. Yeah.
So Victor, we come to you. What was your motivation? I mean, like you said that Mike basically kind of spoke to you about becoming part of the program, but I mean, I'm just curious, like, what was your perspective?
Well, prior to meeting Mike, I had already been working, doing work for the United States Air Force through the Society of Illustrators, their art program that was in conjunction with the Air Force art program. And we would do these missions where they would be about 4 or 5 days. You'd go with a bunch of artists, and you were kind of like chaperoned around, and you really didn't spend too much time on any one situation. So, and I got involved in that because even though I do satirical work and caricatures and stuff like that, there was the other side of me, all the way going back to being a kid, and especially looking at keeping an eye on the work of Howard Brody, who was drawing for CBS at the time, the courtroom art. I said, God, I'd love to do this kind of stuff too. And then when I got to meet Howard and we started talking, and I realized what a significant part he played in the World War II as a combat artist. And jumping back now, or jumping forward, when I was with the Air Force, I was like, okay, now I want to really try to do something where I'm not just a couple hours with some group. I want to really spend some time. And that's where the fortuitous meeting with Mike and getting hooked up and getting the opportunity to go over to Afghanistan because of something I was doing with another group, the Troops First Foundation. And I went with them on a celebrity meet and greet, sports celeb meet and greet thing. And I was just drawing soldiers and Marines over there. And I met a major for a dust-off unit who asked me to draw his unit. And we were just about ready to leave to go to another spot. And I said, I can't do it, but I can take some pictures. And that became a correspondence with them. And then I finally managed to get over to Afghanistan and embed for a few weeks with the 152nd Arctic Thunder. So that picture you saw before, the snipers, that was also from the same training exercise that Elise was talking about, the urban combat training exercises. In that situation, I had the opportunity to sit for an hour and a half while these snipers, these Marine snipers, were setting up position and just for the most advantageous response. The gentleman, the Marine standing behind, kept on jumping around and looking out the windows and telling his gunner, where to best train his weapon on. Lots of drawings, lots of photographs, and then you saw one before in the introduction. That was one of the prelims, and then you just kind of threw it together, and I made it into a painting.
So one of the things I was going to say that I've noticed in all the work that you do is that you embed the viewer right into the image. I mean, like this is probably, I don't know, but this is not a typical perspective of an image.
I went up to the next level on the training boat or the battleship, and just kept on looking down. And I said, this is an interesting point of view and I did a bunch of sketches that way and took a whole slew of photographs and kind of came home and started throwing it together into a painting as well.
This is currently hanging in the National Museum of the Marine Corps, by the way. This image.
Beautiful, very beautiful. So one of the things that you all sort of remarked about was the fact that as you're depicting these soldiers, you start to develop a rapport with them. And so this next sort of round of images sort of focuses on the faces of the soldiers. So I've got a couple here by Elise. Do you want to talk about these, Elise?
Yeah, this image in particular was when we were in Iraq. We first went to Kuwait. So myself and Victor were covering events that were going on the base there. And one event was the female engagement team, or the FET team. And for me, I was a part of the FET team on one of my deployments in 2015. So it was really interesting for me to see their training from an outside perspective. And for those that don't know, the FET team started out as a Lioness program, where female Marines would attach to infantry units in situations where the men couldn't talk to the women or children, for instance. So they had FET team come in and help them with that. So that's what this Marine was doing. She was training on the FET team. So I got to do a little, this is a Prismacolor sketch. There's also about 6 other drawings of them in my actual sketchbook. So I was with them all day.
And then you had a few renditions of this soldier, but I chose this one.
Yes. This piece in particular was I got to go to the embassy in Baghdad, and I was on the roof with the Marines up there, and these were snipers. And they were sitting around for about an hour with their weapon systems because the CEO, the commanding officer, was coming around to look at the weapon systems, kind of like a little tour. And so it was the golden hour, and I managed to do a sketch on location of this Marine. And I loved it so much that I decided to partake in what's called metal point drawing, which for those that don't know is a technique used before the invention of graphite. So this is silver and gold wire. The original is very big.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was interesting to connect the glow, like the golden wire with the golden hour. But yep.
From a curatorial perspective too, we're very happy to have this in the Marine Corps collection, not only because it's a very nice drawing, but because it's silver and gold point. It's a wonderful sort of homage to older.
It really forces you to pay attention to the details of that Marine that you're drawing very closely. So.
Beautiful drawing. I love the cross hatching on the right side, slight shadow over his shoulder and his hand.
Thank you.
Delicate.
Very nice. Chris.
Yes, sir.
You had a few portraits that you included in the work that you
Sure.
did. So here's one.
Okay, so this was this is in Iraq. I was I had just re-enlisted, and within a few months I was over wondering what I had done. And we talked about training earlier. I had received a little bit of familiarization firing again with the M16, and I had to get used to the new gear. And then with just a few weeks, within a month, I was overseas with a unit, and I was at Fallujah, Camp Fallujah, and I'd suddenly a casualty. I was sketching in Fallujah Surgical, and suddenly several casualties came in. This kid actually was wounded in an accident at a range with a law rocket system. But he's of the recon battalion, and so I was sketching all these individuals in here, and it just struck me as a sort of this young kid, once again the flower of our youth, fearless, and they've got their whole life ahead of him, and luckily, of course, he was not killed, but I couldn't resist sketching, and they let me in. They would not let me in with a camera, by the way, so I had to go in with my sketchbook and just go feverishly, and so I did a series of drawings of not only this young gentleman, but of this young Marine who was part of my old reserve unit, the 24th Marine Regiment. And so I took a series of sketches of the surgery, which they would not have allowed me to do with a camera. So I kind of wish I had gotten some color studies and some photographs. I would have done a bigger painting of this, but and several of the surgeries. But it just really was a good thing to capture. And in a sketch, I think when you get a sketch that it works, it may not be perfect, but it can help tell a story in ways that sometimes a bigger painting can't. There's certain things about it that are very valuable. So I enjoyed this one.
And then you had this one here, Benjamin Shorthouse.
Yeah, this is one in the training, in the same training that we've been talking about. The young lieutenants get trained in how they're going to do their thing. And so this is in a briefing beforehand, and they're all sort of gathering and listening to people talk, and basically give a brief pre-patrol brief. And so this is actually the time, and the other artists will probably ratify this, most of the time when you really get a chance to draw, even though there's not a lot of time, and it's like a few moments, you have to learn how to really render as efficiently as you can. And they're really kind of like these practice scribbles where you sort of get in the zone, and it takes a few rough ones, then eventually you're starting to really, dash it here and dash it there, and it comes across as kind of what you want. But the only times you really get a draw is when there's mainly downtime. I've only actually drawn once in a sort of active situation, and that was when I was on a rooftop when I was secure from being, shot or anything like that. But this is a training exercise. But I submitted this one simply because it's, once again, I think the sketch worked relatively well, and it talks about that person. So it's Second Lieutenant Shorthouse.
There's a certain emotion from the sketching that you don't get with photographs. And I think this is a good example of, why we draw, why we are still relevant.
You're always grateful for these briefs because they can go on for about 45 minutes to an hour. And you have the Marines in this situation are a captive audience. They're not moving around. So you actually have a chance to draw them frozen.
Michael,
Even then, you'd be amazed at how much someone can move even when they're standing still.
Yeah, that's true. I find nap time in between missions is the most guaranteed body.
Yeah.
Michael,
Well, my
you,
best work is sleeping Marines.
Yeah, me too.
I have a great drawing of Chris asleep.
There you go.
Working hard.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is all these people see all these drawings of people just sitting around and sleeping and such, and they're like, "What are these? What are our boys doing over there? Or what are our young women? Whatever."
so Michael, you had a few portraits as well, and what struck me with your images, they're very similar to that 2,000-yard stare. I mean, some of these
Sure.
soldiers are definitely have seen some battle or seen some action. Do you care to speak about some of these? I've got a few of them for you.
Sure. I just want to reflect it because Victor and I have talked, and also Steve, but Victor and I are only 1 year apart. Steve's still in his 50s.
Just turned
but
60.
You did? Oh my gosh.
Today.
Oh, happy
Looking good.
birthday.
Wow.
Wow. But we grew up in a generation that, we were glued to all those old Life magazines and those first art books that came out with like Tom Lee's artwork and others, Kerr Eby, and then trying to copy it. I think Victor and I, our politics might be very different, but we certainly grew up, drawing Revolutionary War soldiers, Howard Pyle's, the going up, Bunker Hill and all that stuff, which is fascinated. And I also want to mention that I think one of the things about the body of artwork from I don't even know if this war is over, but our longest war is there's a lot of artwork I know that I have and others of female soldiers and Marines, and in particular, minorities, African Americans. And so this is one of the first pieces I did. Was at Kandahar Airport. I know what her name is. It's somewhere, but off the top of my head. But she was a supply Marine. When a Marine Corps unit deploys, it essentially has three elements: has a ground element, has an aviation element, and a fleet service and support element, the supply. And so she was there. She had I don't have it in the picture, but she had a squad automatic weapon. Because even the supply people, they got to provide their own security and their own whatever. And there she was at Kandahar International Airport, and she was on her way doing something. So this was from a photograph, and so that this is just people had what I call the look. So it wasn't hard to find the look because they had been there. It was really tough. It was freezing cold. You had to sleep with your water, because I'm here to tell you, you cannot drink frozen water. It may sound obvious, but boy, when you're somewhere where it's really cold, you got to keep your water liquid because it'll freeze up pretty quick. And so I was very conscious of doing something like this, of the historical importance. Not only did she have a great face, but it was like, here she was, 1,000, 10, 20, whatever, 8,000 miles from home. At this blown up Kandahar International Airport, serving. And, but I was also conscious of, especially like Tom Lee, Kerr Eby, Howard Pyle, the people that had gone before me. And yeah. Now this one here, this is Kyle Carpenter. He retired a corporal, but this is when he was a lance corporal. This is probably about not quite 3 months after he had gotten wounded, and Kyle was a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. He threw himself on a hand grenade to protect his buddy. They were on a rooftop, and miraculously he survived. And so he was. We were down at the VA hospital, McGuire VA Hospital, Veterans Affairs Medical Center down in Richmond. And he was down there going through some neurological treatment for his wounds. And essentially his right side was the part that got the most, but on the left side, they did a lot of skin grafts and things from that side. Eventually Kyle would lose his right eye. And probably the interesting story about this, and he has a brand new set of teeth because all his teeth were blown out, was his face had all this sort of bluish gray, what they call gunpowder tattooing. So all those scars were deeply bluish gray. And I said to Kyle, and he was sort of half out of it, but I said, are they gonna laser that stuff out? And he goes, no. He goes, it'll blow up. So he still has the scars. In fact, he at one point before he got the Medal of Honor, he had a Twitter thing where it was called "Chicks Dig Scars." So eventually it did. He said it would reabsorb, and it did. So he looks pretty good now. He's grown kind of a reddish beard.
Looks great.
Quite a kid, quite an individual. That's Kyle. But what we started this thing called the Joe Bonham Project, and Victor alluded to it. And I think everybody here in one way or another has participated, either directly or in the case of Steve, contributing artwork to our exhibits of the Wounded Warrior art. But this is where that particular project started. Was with.
And Mike, you were some of the first people to actually document Kyle Carpenter's recovery before news media or anything like that got a hold of the story, correct?
Yeah, had not hit the news. The Marine Corps was still, so there's a whole process of investigating. All I knew at that point was that he had got blown up by a grenade. He didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. And then he was honored because he comes from South Carolina, and so the South Carolina State Legislature had honored him because it had leaked out that he was being evaluated for the Medal of Honor. And I've stayed friends with him. He's really a nice kid, and yeah, quite a journey he had, and he had some tough times. I mean, he's written a book about it, so it wasn't all guts and glory. He went through some tough times, and he's willing to talk about it. This piece here that you're showing now, Rich, Chris and I had went, and sometimes training is a lot harder than actually being in combat. And we spent 2 weeks with a Marine Reserve battalion out at 29 Palms for something called Mojave Viper. And Mojave Viper is a very intense, very dangerous live fire training evolution. And then we went to their send-off from where their reserve unit was leaving out of New Jersey. And as an aside, Chris and I got to meet, and I'm sure Victor knows this name, Joe Kubert, who is the famous illustrator that did Sergeant Rock, because I certainly spent hours upon hours copying his artwork from the Sergeant Rock comic books. But the families were saying goodbye, and they had little kind of very stiff paper American flags. And so like a lot of times, you're trying to do some sketching, but there's a lot going on. And I think Stephanie had said, one of the things sketching does, it helps you prioritize the elements in a chaotic event. I wrote that down. That's a great quote. And so there was just these pictures, and there was just this father hugging his son, and just the look on his face, because his son doesn't see that look. I don't think he showed his son that look, but it's a big part of the whole experience, the little flags and the parents. So we wanted to make that part of the art collection because, these military families, I know what Kyle's parents went through, and, certainly this father's he doesn't know what's going to happen. Hopefully his son came back, whole.
Can you speak a little bit about the John Bonham Project? We've referenced it, but I'm not quite sure everyone knows what it is.
Well, it's called the Joe Bonham Project, and Joe Bonham is a fictional character He's the main character in Dalton Trumbo's World War I anti-war book called Johnny Got Its Gun. And I know most of my hippie 60s baby boom generation, it was a book that we read. And then I think they made a movie about it. But Joe Bonham, I mean, I think the book, it's harder to read than Kafka's Metamorphosis, because Joe Bonham, he gets blown up by friendly fire, loses his arms, his legs, his entire face, ears, everything. But he's a medical miracle. And the doctors, they just think he's a medical miracle. They don't realize that Joe, the soul, is still in there. And he learns to sort of tap the, I'm moving my shoulder here. He learns to tap his stubs to communicate, and they realize he's there. Unfortunately, Joe is asked towards the end of the book, like, what does he want? And he just says, well, I want to be put in a glass case and taken around the world to show people what war is all about. And sort of like the final scene from the first Indiana Jones movie, he's sort of carted off to anonymity with orders that nobody should really communicate and talk to him. So existentially, the book does not end well with Joe Bonham. Well, when we started going into the hospitals and seeing these young Marines and soldiers, most of them were Marines and soldiers, with these unbelievably catastrophic wounds. I mean, Kyle Carpenter, he coded 3 times just on the Air Force flight to Germany. And what these people survive, and certainly Victor can speak to, he got to be really good friends. I mean, I know him, but with a young Marine named Jason Ross, who pretty much physically has what's just simply necessary to exist. And incredible story. And so, but the Joe Bonham Project was essentially to bring these Joe Bonhams out and tell their story. They were still, they're still in the fight. That's the long and short of it.
Thank you, Michael. I think people will appreciate that. For the next sort of set of images, I'm going to go back to something that Chris spoke about the fact that sometimes you use a camera as a means of creating reference, but there are certain situations where you're not permitted to bring a camera, so you have to oftentimes draw from memory or do sketches. And I think in one of our conversations, we spoke about that specific to prisoners. And so the next set of images covers that. So Steve, I have a few images here that you've depicted of prisoners, these prisoners and those going to Guantanamo Bay.
Right, so this was from Samara. I think it was late 2003. It was before the Abu Ghraib scandal happened, which kind of emphasized these hoods that they put over the prisoners' heads because they had physically abused a lot of them with these hoods on, so they stopped using them. They were visually very striking, though, to have people walking around with these. They're actually sandbags. These guys were waiting interrogation in a joint U.S. and an Iraqi facility. It was a little bit questionable because clearly the Iraqis' idea of human rights was different from the Americans' idea of human rights. And there was actually when I made this drawing, it was maybe, I don't know, a few hours after an insurgent had fired an RPG into this base, very small base, and killed an Iraqi who sold DVDs to the soldiers. And then an Iraqi policeman had gone and brought these people in and said he'd found them with an RPG. So it was hard to know. I was told because of the Geneva Convention that I couldn't photograph them, but I could draw them. That rule, by the way, often changed depending on what unit I was with and how long I'd been there. In any case, it had the advantage of not being able to take a photograph. You had to work fast and you had to really make it count. I've always thought that one key difference between photography and drawing is that it takes a while to make a drawing. And you have to really linger over all the details to get it to look right, to get the proportions right, to get the sense of how hands are when they're bound together behind somebody's back. And in that process, you can't help on some level but kind of empathize with the person you're drawing, regardless of whether they're innocent or guilty, just as a human being. And it's that kind of sympathy that transfers into the drawing that I think gives it a sort of a naturally more emotional character than a photograph generally has. It's the thing that drawing has, that kind of immediacy of line, where there's almost nothing in between your own thoughts and then the line going down on the piece of paper.
So here's another, this is a sketch that you created, and I'll show the final image.
Yeah, so this was another situation where I couldn't take photographs. And I was drawing so quickly. This was up in Mosul in 2007, I think it was. I had been out on patrol all day drawing with this one unit, and then they got redirected to this large airport called Diamondback, where there was a giant prisoner transfer. They're all being loaded onto this huge C-17. And it was surreal because half these guys were barefoot or they had slippers on. They were all blindfolded and shackled together, and being loaded on this thing that looked like it was out of Star Wars. So I was drawing as quickly as I could. And in my fast drawing, you can see I got the proportions completely wrong. The guy on the left looks like he's 10 feet tall. But nevertheless, it overall gives the impression that I was looking for, which was this kind of, I guess, this sort of ambiguity of, you know, of being an occupying power and arresting all these people and sending them from one place to another, and the difficulty of telling who's innocent, who's guilty, and all the sort of complications that involves. This was a large painting, like the other one, something that I then did based on models back in the studio. By large, I guess it's around 8 feet tall, so it's probably around 15 feet wide. I staged people on the roof of my studio at night in order to get the dramatic lighting, and then spent a lot of time in Photoshop kind of selecting different poses and different people to put them together. And this painting is called Empire.
And then I had one more image that you did that shows like a whole bunch of sort of iterations going on.
Right, so this is from the Baghdad ER in, what was it? I think it was 2007. As I said, this was during the surge, so we had a lot of casualties coming in. Usually they came in by helicopter, but if a unit got hit while in Baghdad, they'd often just race right to the hospital, which was in central Baghdad. And in this case, the guy that they brought in died. They had a kind of ritual where they would hang out, the body would be put in this, it was a container, a frozen container that would act as a temporary morgue. And all of the guys' buddies would hang out. They referred to it as guarding the body, until it was sent out by helicopter to Balad and then on to Dover Air Force Base. So they would just hang out and chit chat. Of course, I asked them permission to make the drawing and did kind of a composite drawing of people. So all the drawing was done on the spot, and then I added the color and a little bit of gouache after the fact. And then the other part of this thing that was kind of beautiful, they had a ritual called the Angel Flight, where whoever was there when the guy died, or the docs or nurses that were there when he was pronounced dead, would all file out when the helicopter would arrive to transport the body. And they'd bring the body out, everybody would line up. And I was able to draw that too, again, something that they didn't want me to photograph. So that felt like kind of an honor to be able to draw that.
Steve, you have a great story that you've told on a couple of occasions about being in the ER and everybody who was non-essential ordered out. And I'll let you take over.
Yeah, that was something that was really, I felt it was really important about being a combat artist or an artist in Iraq. And it also sort of speaks to what the Marines were saying about being a soldier first and an artist second. That when in the Baghdad ER, when a mass casualty event would happen, all the docs and nurses would kind of descend on it, and all the beds would be filled with soldiers that were groaning or unconscious. And somebody would usually walk into the room and say, all non-essential personnel need to leave right now. And I kind of decided early on that I was going to consider myself an essential personnel, that my role was there to be an artist, to record what was going on. And unless somebody directly ordered me to leave the room, I wouldn't leave. I would just keep on drawing, which often involved passing stuff to the doctors and nurses when they were operating. But nobody ever asked me to leave. And that is, I think that when you decide you're going to be an artist in a situation that is as fraught as a combat zone, you have to decide that you are as fully committed to that role through thick and thin as much as the soldiers are committed to their role or the doctors are committed to their role. And it's only by making that full commitment that you can expect to get something which is going to be interesting, I think.
Victor, we talked about this the other day, this image, because this is an image that benefits from someone who's drawing, because this is actually an amalgam of a number of different, this is something that depicts an event or a scene over time. It's not all these folks were in the room while you were drawing this, or at least at the same time.
Yeah, the senior master guns, who was sitting at the desk there, and asked me, and Elise, I believe we were all on this mission, right?
Yeah.
With John Deckard as well, and we were covering, again, training exercises, but these were the people behind the scenes. This is not the Sergeant Rock stuff. And the senior master sergeant came over to me and said, "Is it possible that you can come and just spend time with us in our tent where we do the command operations control?" And I said, "Sure, I'll come." Couldn't bring a camera, so this was a matter of spending the afternoon sitting down in the spot and drawing. This was just one of the drawings. And then I kind of turned my attention to what was to my left, and just drew the Marines coming in and out of the scene there, sitting down, getting up. I actually did a couple of double portraits in that one of of Marines both sitting down and standing up. But in this situation, again, I was just facing one direction, and as the events transpired, I added people coming into the situation. And it allowed me to think of the shading. It allowed me to get more of a control of the depth of field, what was going on in there. And it's what we would call not sexy. But it's also essential to what's going on in the middle of a war game.
So that actually will lead well into the next set of images. Unfortunately, we lost Chris. I don't know what happened to him, but the next set of images are actually his. And it's basically focusing on the sort of everyday life of a soldier and the work that they do. So we'll take a look at some of these, and we'll look at Chris's. Hopefully he'll come back on and we can let him speak to them. But this is one, and then there's another one where two soldiers are working on, or sailors are working on sonar. I really loved this in this next image. I mean, it's just an amazing piece of art, but it's also just, it just shows that it's not all action. It's you know, sort of dedication to your craft.
Well, I'm going to cross-reference with Michael here. Mike, this looks like when we were on the Patan.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what I can't see what on his hat what it says.
No, but I know the face because I drew him.
Oh, sure.
And so, yes, this is off the
You
back
recognize?
of the baton.
Yeah.
And then Elise, you spoke about drawing animals. This is one of them. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yes, this is when we were in Iraq and we were waiting for the command there to get us into an area that we were having trouble getting into. And there was this dog who I later learned was named Alfie, lying down in the shade outside. And it was about 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And I was like, oh my gosh, I finally have a model that's not going to move on me. And so I was able to draw him for like 30 minutes. And then he started following us around everywhere we went. The Marines out there adopted this dog as their base dog, and he got special treatment. Because, you know, there's a lot of stray dogs in that area. And so they were able to take in this dog, and he was very much a morale booster for the Marines. I posted this drawing later on, and I've gotten so many comments of Marines that were deployed out there being like, "Oh, Alfie, we miss Alfie," and it was like a morale booster for them of a drawing that was a morale booster. So, yeah, pretty cute drawing.
So I'm now hearing that Chris might be in the YouTube chat. Okay, well, I just sent them off the information so he can connect back. At least you had another image here.
Oh,
Can you
yeah. This is when me and Victor were in transit from, I believe it was Iraq back to Kuwait, and we stopped in Baghdad on the tarmac out there, and we ended up being, Victor, it must have been like 3 hours of waiting from what I remember, because Victor did a drawing of the similar situation, and it was very muggy, very hot, and we had to keep our flaks on, because we didn't know when we were going to take off again. So I managed to get this sketch of the Marines on location, just sitting there waiting to take back off. But yeah, that was a good day. And then this is a female. Her name is Sergeant Esquivel. She's one of 2 female tankers. And what's interesting to me is, as combat artists, you know, we're supposed to solidify history, and as we know, tank platoons in the Marine Corps are being discontinued. So to look back at this drawing as, you know, females are just starting to integrate into tank platoons and stuff like that, I was actually able to document one moment of this Marine here. She was actually teaching other Marines how to take care of the tank and the maintenance. I think she was draining some oil or something like that. But now this moment in time is forever documented, where we may not ever get that moment again because we don't have tanks anymore.
She's got a cigar, Elise?
She has a cigarette. She had a cigarette in one hand and some like screwdriver in the other hand, and she was in charge of the tank platoon. So everyone had nothing but great words to say about her, and she was pretty cool. So
I was unaware of the discontinuation of the tank.
Yep, very recent, within the last 2 months or so.
Actually, I have a question from Adriana in the crowd. She asks, what does an embedded artist career look like? Will you keep going at it, or is this just a chapter in your career? And Elise, maybe you want to speak to us since you just completed your...
Yeah. For me, it's, well, when I joined the program, I obviously made the decision to enlist into the Marine Corps first, because that passion I felt for the program, I wanted to see from a first person perspective. So I decided to enlist with a college degree, and I don't see that passion for storytelling going away, even though I've taken off the uniform and I'm a civilian again. I see myself where these gentlemen are in 30 years, carrying on the mantle, trying to keep the program strong, and whatever that looks like 30 years from now, for me, I won't ever stop.
Yeah, could you repeat that question again? What is
The question is, what does an embedded artist career look like? Is this just a chapter in your career, or is this something that you might keep up if permitted to?
Well, it's a facet of the career. It's not necessarily a chapter. It's a facet because I think we all do something else. I mean, Steve is a fine art painter. I'm an illustrator. And this is one of the things we do, which is, and for me, it's one of the things that inspires me in many ways more than sitting in a drawing table. So it's just another section of a career that until I guess I drop dead, I'll still be doing in one way, shape, or form. But I'm also, you know, I'm looking at 67, and I'm also very well aware that it's just not that much fun anymore being in 130-degree heat when at that age, especially loaded up with flak and Kevlar. So,
You know, I think that Mike was using the term reportorial art or something like that. And I think that that's really apt because you don't obviously have to go to a war zone to make drawings of interesting things that are happening from life.
Right.
So, for me, that's meant during COVID in New York City, I did a lot of drawings of the morgue trucks outside the hospitals and the impromptu hospital setup in Central Park. And then when all of that kind of morphed into the protests, I began to draw those, as well as the looting that took place on Broadway. And then I went out to Portland and did drawings of the protests out there. So, there's no reason, although I had to have a gas mask with me in Portland, but there's many things you can draw, which are still current events, not necessarily a war, where the drawings can stand on their own, or you could then base oil paintings around them.
Actually, I wanted to share this one because you actually shared this one late in the game, Steve, but it was one that struck me. And it's I don't know if I would call it slice of life, but it's definitely an aspect of life.
Yeah, for sure. This was the Baghdad ER. And this was probably in between drawings inside, and I was wandering around and suddenly just noticed this on one side of the wall where all the stretchers that would come in with sweat and blood and all the rest of it would get hosed off and then let to dry in the sun. And that just struck me right there as a kind of a, sort of metaphor for the role that the hospitals are playing in a war zone, the role of having to help people, but also the inevitability of watching them die. And while I was making the drawing, the two helicopters sort of fortuitously came up, delivering more people for the ER.
And actually in this image here, I don't know if you'd call it slice of life or it's portraits, but it's actually looking not so much at the soldiers, but the people that you're interacting with. And Michael, you drew these.
Yeah, I'm especially same in Iraq, but in Afghanistan, they were all different types, and so this is one sheet of paper, and I don't know what to say about it. It's just they were, the different personalities that the different types. The young kind of goofy kid, the old guys, the interpreter. I think we've sort of talked about that. Part of hopefully what we can do with art is to challenge or at least challenge stereotypes. You get one story of from photography or from the news, and you get a whole nother story from what we do. I think I mentioned this yesterday when we were all kind of speaking that a museum director once said that reportage art, hand-drawn analog art, he called slowed vision. I don't know if he was inspired by the whole slow food movement, but it does something else. I mean, and there's enough misinformation and stereotype running around in the world. And you had mentioned about what was this just a phase of our lives or whatever, and some of us have got together and we did something, an extension maybe of the Joe Bonham, called the Emergent Artists of the Pandemic, where we went out and did artwork of the people that, especially when this whole thing first started back in March and April, that were staying on the front lines, and to tell their story as well. So this is just sometimes you're out there and there's so much going on, and I just was clicking a lot of pictures of all the different Afghani types, and then I think they work better as drawings than they do as photographs, because you editorialize, you leave a lot out, background stuff. I guess like Photoshop, you play around with the intensity of light, things like that. Yep.
I have a quick question for Steve. In your large format paintings, what medium are you working in?
They're oil on linen.
Thank you. And we also have an artist in the one of our viewers is Mark Payton. And he's indicating that he's going to be doing weekend work with the National Guard. And he also just mentioned that the Society of Illustrators sends people to document the Air Force. And I think, I don't know if you might have been you, Victor, that mentioned that to me as well.
We had a long history with it. We have not really done anything with the Air Force in quite a few years now because it didn't get defunded officially, but it lost a lot of funding. And so I can't remember the last time I went on an Air Force mission.
Yeah, I would say right now, the Marine Corps essentially has the most highly functioning combat art program.
Well, the most proactive for sure.
Most proactive, yeah. And I don't know, I mean, I was involved, and then with Chris being the official artist in residence, there was a particular sergeant major who I don't know who got involved and got in front of, I think, the commandant of the Marine Corps, the last commandant, and lobbied very successfully for there to be money. Money's very important to give it a more permanent footing. Because the Marine Corps has a sports program, it has the Marine Corps Marathon, has the silent drill team, has the the President's Own, the Commandant's Own, has very involved music programs. And I think somebody was able to get the Commandant's ear and say, by the way, the Marine Corps has a pretty well recognized art program that's world class. So I think we're on good footing. As Victor said, some of the other services are not as active at the moment.
All right, so we're going to run into our last section, which is just some memorable moments. And I'm going to start with you, Michael. This is one that you spoke about.
Yeah, this is a composite. It's called Lance Corporal Fuller Mourns, and the Marine at the bottom in the foreground is obviously Lance Corporal Fuller. He was a combat engineer, and this was November 16th, 2005. And Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines Regiment was in a place called Old Ubaidi out in Al Anbar Province. And it was literally the last day of something called Operation Steel Curtain. And Fox Company was clearing out a small village called Old Ubaidi in an elbow of the Euphrates River. And Lance Corporal Fuller, his job was just to, with C4, to blow open the door of a house. And then a fire team rushed in, and the entire fire team was killed. Then their lieutenant went in with some other people, and he was shot and eventually died. And so Lance Corporal Fuller was just sort of sitting, and he was crying. He wasn't sobbing, but the tears were just running down his face. And I combined that with two other photo references. And in the middle ground are the bloody hand that's sort of to the left of Lance Corporal Fuller's is of a young lieutenant, Ryan McLaughlin. And then there's Marines in the background with the body bags, taking them to the waiting helicopters. So, yeah, that was a pretty intense day. And I don't know how much more I can say about it. It's just that deep, quiet grief. The movies aren't too good at showing, but anybody that's seen guys, even like Steve doing those, the buddies waiting to find out if their buddy's dead and then waiting for the angel flight. It's just that deep. I don't even know if we have a word for it. It's just that deep, quiet grief, and then carrying the bodies out to the waiting aircraft. I mean, it's hard to carry a dead body in a poncho, and you can feel these guys, 4 Marines, really feeling the weight and leaning, and they're desperately, they don't want to drag that body on the ground at all. So I was conscious of, in my own personal experience, but how this, the metaphor of weight, the weight of grief, and the Marines who took the bodies out to the helicopters. I mean, there's a whole group of them I stay attached to on Facebook, and they're all talking about it now because it's the 15-year anniversary. And for all of them, it's as fresh today as it was 15 years ago. So that's that image.
Steve, you had this story to talk about.
This was also at the Baghdad ER. At that time, the Al-Qaeda insurgents were blowing up these homemade bombs, which consisted of barrels of chlorine that would be in a truck. And the explosion would atomize the chlorine and destroy the lungs of anybody that breathed it in, which were often women and children. And in this case, this had happened in Ramadi, and a whole bunch of kids were flown in by helicopter. I want to say 6, something like that, and I think 4 of them died. This was a little kid who was 18 months old, who they called him Henry. They didn't know his real name. There was no immediate family in Baghdad. Besides drawing Henry, his lungs were in bad shape, and he cried a great deal when he wasn't sleeping. But the docs and nurses would come in when their shifts were done and just hold him and comfort him. And actually, I did a drawing of that, and I couldn't locate that drawing is somewhere, but I couldn't find it. But in any case, watching that happen, and I often talked, of course, to the doctors and nurses about their experience there, and they'd emphasize how when they lost somebody, they tried not to dwell on it. All the sort of waste baskets in the operating rooms had red plastic bags for all the limbs that they would throw in there. So it was an intense place. And but when they would come to hold Henry, it felt like they were as much sort of helping themselves on an emotional and a spiritual level as they were hoping to heal Henry. And it was a very, very powerful thing to watch.
Thank you. And Elise, we spoke about this a little earlier in the program, but can you talk a little bit about this image?
Yeah, this image was in 2015. I was 1 week into our deployment with the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit, and I happened to be attached to 3-1 out of Camp Pendleton for about 7 months before our deployment to integrate with them. So I really grew to understand these guys, and they knew who I am. Well, on this particular day, we were debarking the ship on Ospreys to do some training in Hawaii just to prepare for the deployment, one last training opportunity. And unfortunately, one of the Ospreys crashed, and we lost 2 Marines and 21 Marines were injured. For me, I don't want to say the situation reinvigorated what I was doing, but it reminded me of the importance of what it meant to document every moment. Whether somebody wanted to necessarily be sketched or not, I was still there to document that because I was able to give the families of these Marines those images and those sketches up to almost their last moments on this earth, and share with them the portraits and those moments that they didn't see before I showed them. And so this was my viewpoint of that crash, and that's the black smoke to the right. And I got to hang out with these guys for 2 more weeks. We were all stuck in a small squad bay together, and just to see how they reacted to this situation where none of us were expecting to get killed. We weren't in a combat environment, and to see how they reacted and banded together just made me want to share their story even more.
And Victor, this will end off, we'll have one more image. I'm going to show Chris's, even though I can't seem to connect with him, but we'll talk about your image, which is actually the image that is something that's stuck with me since 5 years ago when you first talked about the combat artist program. I believe these were the images that you showed.
Yes, and in my career, it's the one time that I didn't have my camera with me. I was taken off guard. I was I was away from my tent that I shared with the dust-off unit, and I was just drawing something else. It was a relatively quiet period of time. As a matter of fact, compared to Michael or Steve or Chris, my embed with the 152nd was relatively a PG-13 by comparison. But on this particular very early morning, I was outside just drawing soldiers getting ready to transfer to another station when the helicopter, when the Black Hawk started turning on, and I could hear the rotors behind me, and I only had my sketch pad and some pencils with me, and they were already, the dust-off unit was racing toward the helicopters, the Black Hawks, and I, in a split second, had to choose between trying to go into the tent and very likely missing, because the way they were running to the copters indicated that this was something very serious. And so it was either to go grab my camera and miss getting on board, because my flak and my Kevlar was already in the Black Hawk, or just racing over to the Black Hawk. And I did, and jumped in. As a matter of fact, they were ready to take off, and they suddenly stopped, and then I kind of like just flew into the side door, and started gearing up. And on the way there, I was really scared. I was thinking, from a professional standpoint, I had really screwed up. I did not have my camera with me, and what was I going to do? And I thought of my wife, what she would said, and said, well, this is an opportunity, or rather, this is probably a reason that you weren't supposed to have a camera with you. And I saw that as a reason to really focus. And we did a circle around the area, the town where the convoy had been hit with an IED, the one MRAP. And when we took off, we heard that we were going to be picking up five wounded. On the flight over there, the numbers just dropped down rapidly to the point where we were just basically picking up one seriously wounded. The others had already died. We flew into that. It was a low flight. We were very close to the ground, and it was a very up and down kind of evasive maneuvering, and then we flew right into this cloud of smoke that was over where the MRAP had been hit. And I remember all the ash, all these burning cinders flying inside the cabin, landing on the sketch pad and stuff like that. And I'm shaking it off. You got all this stuff flying into your mouth, this awful metallic kind of tasting stuff. And we did another circle around, tried to land, failed, because there was too much moon dust, too much dust from the ground kicking up, so that our pilot could not see where exactly he was landing. We took off, and we were directed to another spot. At that point, it all got, they brought in the one soldier, and the medics got to work right away. And I just focused on what was in front of me. And I had already been drawing as soon as they brought him in, and then I just kept on drawing. And you have to understand, between the first drawing on the upper left to actually it was the lower left, and then going clockwise, those three were done in approximately the 15 minutes or so that it took us to get back to the hospital. And then when we landed, there was another one that I did. And then there was another one on the flight back to our base, where I was just trying to capture the quiet inside the cabin. Nobody was really talking. And it was obvious that they could not revive the soldier. So that was my closest I came to some real serious visual experience. Also, it was kind of crazy looking down when we were like doing all those evasive movements, looking down into the smoke and just watching all the little motorcycles riding all around. I remember that, you know, this is how the Taliban worked, and you'd see all these motorcycles down below running all over the place, and I just still can taste that awful smoke that had totally filled the cabin. And so I was in a quiet zone. And the thing I really almost forgot to mention was that suddenly became all quiet inside me. And I was in the middle of this hurricane of activity, but in my head, it was totally silent. And it was probably one of the calmest times I've ever had in my life, where it was like a Zen concentration on what was going on below me. The medics were doing what they were doing, fully committed to it, and I was doing what I was doing. And we were all in that moment. And the crew chief was doing her thing, keeping her guns trained on anybody trying to screw with us as we were taking off. It turned out that first failed landing, we would have probably landed on the follow-up IED. So that was one of those fortuitous situations where a failed landing actually worked to our benefit.
Thank you, Victor. Chris, welcome back. Sorry about that. I have your image here. I chose this image. It wasn't one that you chose, but if you were just sort of speaking to this image.
Well, this is one of those images that's another slice of life, and it's during war, but it's on the USS Ronald Reagan. So they were you know, it was still, we weren't in any active combat situation, obviously. But to these young men, their life is very serious at the moment, because they are currently standing outside the hatch of the executive officer, and this is like their preliminary hearing in a captain's mast. They're going to speak to the XO and hopefully argue their case if they've done something wrong, and this is why they're standing there. I was just looking at it like there's these, wow, this is great. You don't see the whites. These guys are in their white uniforms, and I was sketching them and taking photographs. And I kept a journal of what I do, and so I've got their names. One of them there, and the one in the front is Dylan. It's not Orr. The Orr is the other guy's name.
Did you get in trouble?
What's that?
Did you get in trouble in the end?
I wished I didn't ask them the specifics of their case.
Yeah.
All right, so Dylan here he didn't even have any rank to lose, but chances are they're going to lose a stripe. They're both ordnance men, and if you see a young man in his dress uniform on a ship, he's either getting ready to man the rails when they're going into port for liberty, or he is in trouble.
Yeah.
So I couldn't, when I sketched a couple of gentlemen across the way, and then once I started inquiring, I realized the seriousness of the situation. So and they got a little, you know, they were taking it very well. And obviously this young gentleman here, he's still in his youth, and he's not standing at attention or at ease or at rest or anything like that. And I just saw that the composition was very, it said a lot. So I decided to do a painting, and this is like a 14 by 18 or something, a little bit longer than that, but not a big painting.
But this is your Norman Rockwell.
Yeah, this is, I was, like I said, the composition, this is me channeling my inner Rockwell, if I can. I couldn't help but see that, since, of course, Norman Rockwell himself was a sailor, so he might appreciate this, hopefully.
So I have one last question from Dennis Dietrich, and he asks, what are the, I'm trying to find it. What do you guys carry as field kits when you're going in terms of the tools that you work with?
I carry anything that I can shove into pockets quickly, but it just depends on the situation. If we have to move quick, or yeah, I'm still learning that one, but like little watercolor kits, which I haven't used much in the field, but for me, pencils, wax, Prismacolors.
Yeah, I got to see when we toured the Smithsonian. I think, Mike, you were there when we toured the military collection for the Smithsonian.
Oh,
We got to see Harvey Dunn's sketch box, and it was brilliant. It was
Yeah.
like a little metal engineer's case, and he had the scrolls in it, and it goes, the scrolls went up and out and over. I never could replicate that. I called the Army historian and asked him if it was something that they could find, but it was obviously customized. But normally I just carried some sketchbooks of 11 by 14 or smaller. Victor carries big ones, don't you, Victor?
Victor,
Whatever I can fit into these.
All right.
there we go. Yep.
Yeah, you got to be expeditionary. That's the key. You're a reportage artist, and so you've got to be able to not be in the way, and it's got to be handleable in all sorts of, like going up ladder wells or in armored vehicles. You have to be able to get there.
Also,
What I
Mike,
find really useful. Oh, go ahead, Elise.
I was gonna say Mike would say using the dirt on the ground to smear around on the canvas.
I find it useful to have a large fishing vest that can fit over a flak jacket. And since I use a lot of washes, get a bottle of something like Gatorade that has a wide mouth that'll fit right in one of the pockets. So you can get ink washes or watercolor, dipping it in that. But just don't forget to put the cap back on when you're done.
Hey, Steve, when you do the ink wash, I've noticed, like, for example, one of the last things I saw before was the POW. I could see how you dropped some ink in, and it spread out, and you get these great graphic things. Is that India ink, or is that watercolor generally?
No, it's. I use a bunch of different inks. Let's see. I'm trying to remember the name of it. FW, I think, is an ink that I use a lot. And then Sennelier. I usually just get brown inks and I kind of mix different ones together.
So do you have it in one of those little metal wells that connects to a board, or how do you do it expeditiously? How do you manage it while you're sitting there? Do you have it connected to your drawing pad?
I just use a bottle, but I hold it in my left hand, and my left arm is supporting the pad.
Oh, okay. All right.
It all seems to work out, as long as the pad isn't too large. That's the kind of the limiting factor.
Well,
So-
Victor, we freaked out the crew of the Bataan because we were up on deck sketching, and they were having flight operations, and we had these large moleskin notebooks. I had my big spiral one, and they were freaking out because they were worried about us what's called FODing the aircraft, which is foreign object debris, and it can go into the engine. So they saw us with these pencils and erasers and whatever, and sketch pads. Anyway.
So what would you, can you all speak a little bit about what you think the future is of this program in terms of what we have in store?
Well, I do know that we are cross services. We have been meeting at a symposium every year, and we had our virtual combat art symposium this just last month or so. We're trying to do, we keep in contact with the curators and the various artists from other branches. For the Marine Corps, I can say that we are actually moving as much as we can to trying to get back to having some sort of MOS. They've been changing public affairs and certain things to where the numbers are shifting, and so we had a secondary MOS for officer artists, and we've been trying to get a enlisted secondary MOS, but that's still kind of in flux because of the way they've changed the manual. So we're trying to get in touch with manpower and try to get something that is more solid in the Marine Corps' manual so that we can recruit and bring in some more high quality uniformed people, as well as the wonderful non-uniformed people we work with. So we'll see how that goes.
I think it's important to note too, at least for the Marine Corps Combat Artist Program, something we do differently is we have such a mentorship, whereas I myself, coming in as a less seasoned artist, get to work so closely with amazing illustrators and fine artists and see how they work. And just that alone will help improve the quality of our program. And I don't think that's something that's ever going to change, because that's just what makes our program so amazing.
Yeah, there's been a lot of serendipity. We talk about fortuitous things. I met Mike online, and then Victor met Mike and different people, and then there's a lot of providence and what they would have called providence and serendipity about these things. It's kind of like a calling.
It is.
Hey, Rich.
Yes.
I just remembered a funny story about art materials in the field. I was in Afghanistan in Helmand Province in 2010, and we came into an ambush, And so everybody had to flatten themselves into these tiny little furrows in a muddy field as close as they could. And I remember when I dropped down, seeing my watercolor palette fly off out of my pocket. I had this momentary decision. Gee, should I go back for the watercolor palette? I thought, no, I can't. There's actually like bullets flying. I'll pick it up later. And then of course we kept on moving. And at the end of the day, when the whole thing was over, it was my only watercolor palette. And I knew I wouldn't be able to get another one in Helmand Province. And I told this to the sergeant as we went back. And the sergeant, with like, you'll pardon my language, this is how Marines talk. He's like communicating with the other Marines. Keep your eye out for the fucking artist's fucking watercolor palette. and we trudged through the fields, never could find it. And I figured some Afghan farmer's son probably grabbed it. But that was the last I saw of it.
Well, at least we have outreach.
Yeah, that's right.
You never know.
So one question that came in was, do artists work across branches, or do they predominantly work within one branch of the military?
Well, each of their branches does their own coordination and sending, obviously, but we do have a collegial, it is a very small pond, shall we say. And so each of the services has just a few artists that they work with. And of course, the Air Force has been working, has a wonderful history with the Societies of Illustrators. And we as well have been very fortunate to have great illustrator and artist people that we can work with. So it is separate. It isn't a joint service officially, of course, but we have, it's such a small group of people that we're collegial, and we do communicate quite often.
Part of the situation, at least from Marine Corps perspective, is with regards to public affairs, every branch of the service has its own separate public affairs branch and mission statement and what we call doctrine. And for Marine Corps combat art, the doctrinal philosophy, I know it sounds like a big phrase, for the Marine Corps for public affairs is, one, to keep America informed about its Marines, and two, to foster the ineffable relationship that America has with its Marines. So part of the story is how the different services look upon all the tools they have to tell their story. And right now, fortunately, for the Marine Corps, art seems to be part of that mix. But just like Elise said, for a long time, the Marine Corps had tanks. Now we don't. Somebody high up decided that part of Marine Corps doctrine no longer required tanks. They were too big, too hard to get off of ships, whatever the decision-making process is. So, right now for the Marine Corps, things are good. They got a resident artist, they got money. You got the National Museum of the Marine Corps. You have a dedicated art gallery and a dedicated artist studio right there in the museum for people to watch. So that's about as good as it gets. I know the Army's going to have its own museum here soon. The Navy Museum is, well, it's on a base nobody can get on. So the future is, right now, the present is good. What the future will be, who knows?
And we haven't even talked about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard does their annual exhibition at the Salmagundi Club, I think it is.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I just want to thank all of you today for participating in this program. I mean, the artwork that you've put forward has just been truly amazing. I'm in awe of everything that you all do, and I'm very thankful that we've had this opportunity. So I just wanted to say thank you to all the people that came. If you are in the New England region, we do have an exhibition going on right now called Norman Rockwell Imagining Freedom. And as Stephanie alluded to earlier, although it doesn't necessarily focus on veterans, a lot of the work depicted within covers World War II and the efforts of our veterans to secure the peace. So with that, I just want to thank you all again. And I hope you all have a very happy and safe Veterans Day, and I'm looking forward to maybe having this conversation again. So thank you.
Well,
Thanks, Rich.
it's been a pleasure to be with these folks.
Thank you. Well, take care and Godspeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here.
Thanks a
Take care.
lot.
Bye.
Alrighty.